some ideas about what language is and about what language learning is. And it's probably the single most popular one now. If you ask people worldwide what is their teaching approach, they'll say they use a communicative approach. The key idea of the communicative approach is the recognition early on that the goal of language is to communicate with it. And the goal of language is not to demonstrate that you can learn a language and score high on a grammar test, which unfortunately is the way that a lot of institutions, all the way up through ministries of education, actually treat it. And they do that for very practical reasons. It's easy to give, a 50-question multiple-choice test and find out what people know about a language. It's very difficult to do testing that assesses what they can do with the language. One of the big changes that's happened at Stanford in the last, 12 years is the movement toward proficiency-based teaching and assessment that does try and see what you can do with the language. So a lot of the work done, I don't know if it's true of every language here, but certainly the major languages and many of the less commonly taught ones do focus on trying to use a communicative approach. So a communicative approach, I've got a couple of links here you can look at later, but it usually is broken down into 4 areas. Grammatical competence, it doesn't mean just grammar in the way you think of it. This is grammatical in the linguist sense, which includes the sound system. So it includes phonology. Let me go ahead and write down. So these are some words you should be familiar with if you're not already. Phonology is the sound system of a language, and that's really part of grammatical competence in this larger sense of grammar. Morphology. Who knows what morphology is?
Combination of words.
Okay, it's how words combine, how parts of words combine. The morphology studies the minimal units of meaning in a word. So if we take a word like cat, it has 1 morpheme. Cats has 2 morphemes. It has cat plus the plural. Steering wheel has potentially 3. It has steer, the ing part, and wheel, if you consider that a compound. So morphology, some of it has to do with grammatical endings like verb agreement rules, past tense marking, plural, and so on. And some of it has to do with the fact that you can put un in front of something and make it a negative. So happy, unhappy. That's also part of morphology. But that's part of your competence. It's how to create words out of pieces. Syntax is what most people think of as grammar. So the rules for how you construct sentences. And then beyond that, there are sometimes some other things. But that's sort of the key for what they consider grammatical competence. Oh, and then, I'm sorry, your lexicon, or your words. So your vocabulary. Then they have these other areas. Sociocultural competence refers to your ability to use language effectively within the culture that it exists. So, there are a dozen different ways, there are 100 different ways you can ask somebody to do something. Students may be told early on that English has an imperative, just like I was showing you in Albanian. Open the door. Stand up, sit down, take out your pens. Under certain circumstances, that's acceptable. Often it isn't. And, close your books, please, is still considered kind of rude in many settings. So we have all these indirect ways of making requests. Could you close your books? You want to close your books. Why don't you close your books? You can close your books now if you'd like. And various ways. These are called speech acts. So we have various ways of presenting that function. Getting students to understand how to do that is actually very difficult. I work with students in writing classes, advanced graduate students, who can write papers that get published in Science and other top-level journals, and they're really good papers. I have to tweak them a bit, but they're really good papers. They can't write an email to me in a way that I consider culturally appropriate in some cases, because they're going from a different cultural environment. And so being able to understand the target culture and how language brings that in. How do you ask directions from a stranger? How do you thank people at different levels? English is actually easier than a lot of languages. If you take something like Japanese and you have to deal with all the different types of honorifics, depending on who you're talking to and what you're talking about, it can be really tough. Discourse competence takes you beyond the sentence. How do you engage in conversation? One element of discourse competence in a lot of languages is that people get turns. In English, we tend to interrupt each other a lot more often, especially in a discussion setting. In some other languages, like Italian or Arabic, they'll do it even more often. They're a much more high, they throw things back, they throw language back and forth much more rapidly. That's part of discourse competence. It also overlaps with sociocultural competence. Discourse competence, just as you learn how to write in paragraphs and learn how to put paragraphs together into an essay and a thesis, when you speak, you also follow a particular pattern. A lot of native speakers are unaware of it, but they do it pretty well. And so understanding how to structure ideas, whether it's in a monologue like I'm doing now or in a dialogue setting, that's part of discourse competence. The last area, strategic competence, means what you do in order to make your communication successful. And in a lot of cases, that means what do you do when communication breaks down? What happens when you don't have the right word for something? What happens when you don't understand what somebody says? And so, in order to be effective, to have communicative competence in the language, all four of these need to be developed, and relatively simultaneously. A lot of classes focus on this for the first year or two, and don't pay much attention to this. And that's why people come out of it with a lot of language that they can't do very much with.